Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sam Madicott of the British Chamber of Commerce in Japan. It is a pleasure to welcome members and guests from 6 different chambers of commerce from Australia, New Zealand, the British, the Belgium, Luxembourg, the Canadian, the Irish and the Spanish Chamber. We would like to remind you that today is an interactive webinar and therefore we encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Following discussion, we will aim to get through as many questions as possible. Now, to set a bit of context, on August 28th, Shinzo Abe announced his resignation, which will bring an end to his second tenure as Prime Minister, a period of political stability that lasted nearly 8 years, but also leaves behind unfinished business and a controversial legacy in East Asia. Here to discuss matters, we are delighted to welcome Tobias Harris, Senior Vice President at Teneo Intelligence, who has recently released a timely biography, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. And to moderate today's session, Melanie Vock, CEO of Melanie Vock Advisory. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Melanie.
Hello, everybody, and it's great to have 6 chambers of commerce together for this particular webinar. But more importantly, welcome to Tobias. Tobias, I know you through Twitter only, so it feels funny to be here on a webinar, but I'm absolutely delighted to have you here. Thank you for being part of our webinar.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for moderating, and to the British Chamber and your counterparts who are putting this together and hosting me. It's a pleasure, and I mean, certainly just a fantastic moment. And I did not plan on releasing a book about Shinzo Abe the day before he announced, and if you had told me at the start of August, I would have said there's no way, and certainly, and that shows you how quickly things changed. And you know, we weren't necessarily expecting events to unfold the way they have, and I think it catch up over the last couple of weeks.
Well, I was going to give you an award for the most timely release of a biography, because I can't imagine how busy you are at the moment, not only having finished writing such an important piece, but also just in how timely and therefore how much in demand you must be. So we're very delighted that you could be here with us today.
No, really, it's really my pleasure.
And thank you for helping me have a look at your at the writing too, because it gave me a greater sense about what focus you had and what focus we might have today in this webinar. The piece that I thought was particularly interesting is what you describe your book as saying, this book is the story of Abe Shinzo's place in history. Abe, the latest in a long line of Japanese leaders seeking a restoration for their own times, will be remembered for having girded Japan for global competition. Yet his legacy will be increasingly shaped by missed opportunities and postponed decisions to tackle the troubles at home and dangers from abroad that beset Japan in the 21st century. And I thought that really set the story, and so I'll hand over to you. We'll probably play this out. We'll have about 10, 15 minutes of your sort of review of your own book, if you like, or of the circumstances. I'd love to get a bigger sense from you about what you see from this point on, and how Abe's legacy will in fact dictate how Japan is over the next sort of decade, probably in many ways. Also, you know, what you see in political play as we are right in the thick of it today, as the candidates announce and get going. So we'll hand over to you, and then everybody do send your questions. As we've said many times at the Chamber events, we only take good questions, but don't feel the pressure. We want questions that show the scope of the audience that's on board today. So over to you, Tobias. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for that introduction. I'll start just with a brief anecdote. So back, it's summer of 2012. I'm in Japan doing research at the University of Tokyo, and I get an invitation to go see Abe speak. And at this point, Abe is just a backbench LDP member. You know, he'd spent a few years giving speeches, raising his profile. You know, I remembered him because when I was a mere blogger back really starting during his first premiership, I covered his decline and fall, and remember sitting in my apartment in Kamakura when the news broke that he was going to resign, and you know, you could probably go back and look at my blog archives and look at how many words I wrote about that. I mean, it was, you know, it was quite an exciting moment, and I remember covering that, and I remember just sort of the Abe year with nostalgia. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll go see him speak, and just see what he has to say. I mean, obviously, he's not going to be prime minister again, so it doesn't really matter. And it was, of course, it's a year and a half after 3/11, and the air conditioning is not on basically, and it's hot, and it's just like late June in Tokyo. I mean, so it was unbearably hot, and I had.
We know that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, everyone listening, I'm sure knows that. And I remember not being able to keep I could not stay awake. And I mean, it was a real struggle. And so I couldn't even tell you what he said. But then, of course, 3 months later, he's the LDP leader again. 3 months after that, he's the prime minister again. I mean, it just goes to show just what a remarkable achievement that was. And here we are 8 years later. And I don't think, anyway, I'm in the political risk forecasting business. And, if you told me in 2012, he's, not only does, you tell me that day when I went to see him that not only is he going to be prime minister again, but he's going to set every endurance record, and, he'll see out the rest of the decade. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement. The fact that he came back, was a story worth telling, I think. I mean, you don't see, I mean, just the extent to which, the depths that he fell in 2007, and you look at his own recollections about that. And then to come back from that, I mean, I thought very early on in this second premiership that there was a story to tell. And I've been thinking about this book for years, and, finally got myself to do it kind of by 2018 to really start thinking about, what it might look like and getting it done, ideally by the Olympics. And of course, events unfolded differently than I planned. But I mean, that there was really a story to tell. And then, as his tenure got longer, then it became, okay, here's this extraordinary story. He came back, boundless ambitions for Japan, and the kind of things that he wanted to realize. And how does his record now stack up against those ambitions? What he wanted to leave behind? What is he going to, whenever he left, what was he going to leave? And that was really the story I wanted to tell. But as the quote you pulled out suggested, that it's not surprisingly for a tenure as long as this, an almost 8-year tenure, it's a mixed record. I mean, it is definitely as much a record of, many successes, but not necessarily achieving what he, I think, himself wanted to achieve. And I think all you have to do is, go back and watch the press conference, now a couple of weeks ago when he announced that he was resigning. There were moments where he was close to tears, where he definitely was fully aware of what he hadn't achieved. And, we can look at some of the obvious things, like constitutional revision, like, finally settling the abductee issue with North Korea, the pursuit of a territorial settlement with Russia. I mean, I think there are these sort of big issues that he wanted to, to close the door on, to settle the accounts, as he put it, in this case in foreign policy. But, that there are other issues too, where maybe he didn't reflect as much upon, where he also looks like, here was a prime minister who was stronger in a sense of facing fewer rivals, having more control over the government and the political system than any leader I think Japan has ever seen. An unmatched string of electoral victories, looking like the head of not just of Japan as a stable democracy, but as the decade went on, as basically the strongest leader in the democratic world. And as every other leader either faltered or fell from power, and here was Abe sort of left at the end, persisting through quite a challenging moment. But in spite of that, not necessarily being able to translate that power and influence to fundamentally changing Japan's trajectory in the century. And I just want to talk about that a little bit more. I get, every time I give a talk, I get a question about the title of the book. And part of the reason for the title is that I'm not always good at thinking of titles and headlines. And I was just spitballing with my publisher, and we were throwing out ideas, and somewhere like the word popped up, and we chewed it over and thought about it, and it seemed to fit. And as a person and as a politician, I think it is Abe to a T. I mean, that that he comes from this dynasty from his grandfather, maternal grandfather, Keiichiro Asao, that absolutely rejected the compromises that Yoshida and his successors made the U.S. occupation and with the institutions that the U.S. occupation introduced at the end of the war, and intensely sought to uproot those institutions and make Japan a more normal great power, and were repeatedly stymied. And so Abe enters politics in the 90s. The Cold War is over. Japan's economy is struggling, and now you have new opportunities. And I think he deliberately casts himself in this role now of, he's going to be the one to tear down the post-war institutions and build something new in its place. And that was really his fundamental ambition as a politician. He made it very explicit the first time he ran for the premiership in 2006, that he was going to leave behind the post-war regime. That was his catchphrase. He dropped it in 2012, which maybe is symbolic, but it was never far from his thoughts, that he was going to be the one to close all this unfinished business and set Japan on a new course, overcome the constraints of the constitution, overcome demographic constraints and economic constraints, and that Japan would become the independent, strong, great power that Abe and his antecedents had wanted Japan to be. And I think we can safely say after 8 years that is not the course Japan is on. I think Abe has accomplished something different. Several things differently. I think he has shown the limits of what what Japan should expect from a prime minister. I think over the last 30 years, I think the great dream of Heisei era reformers was that Japan needs a strong prime minister who's going to introduce reforms and push Japan in a new direction, and Japan would be great, because it had a strong leader. And I don't think you're going to have a stronger leader. So therefore, I think we've learned that Japan should not necessarily expect that a strong leader is going to be the answer to all of its problems. I think what he did do was show that there are ways Japan can live with some of the constraints that it's come to accept, that it's going to have to live with a shrinking population. It's going to have to live with some of the challenges of depopulating regions, parts of the country that just don't have the same engines of growth. And they can keep trying to experiment and find ways to make life better for people, but that you're not going to. I don't think there's going to be a point where they can say we have solved Japan's problems once and for all. I think the region around Japan is in such flux. And Abe invested so much energy in a strong U.S.-Japan relationship as an anchor for Japan's relations with the region going forward. That is never going to be settled. 2016, the introduction of a U.S. president, or the arrival of a U.S. president who had long questioned the U.S.-Japan relationship and forcing Abe to work that much harder to keep the U.S. engaged in the region. That work is never going to be over. The relations with China, the ebbs and flows we've seen over Abe's entire tenure, that you had the moments where they weren't talking to this fragile rapprochement after 2016 to whatever new era we're in now, as Japan's China hawks, I think, feel emboldened. Now that relationship is going to forever be in flux, and so Abe, I think, has done some new things to strengthen Japan's position in the region. I think he's strengthened relations with India, with Australia, with the countries of ASEAN, all things that will serve his successors well going forward. But the work is never going to be done, and Japan is going to live with some limitations that will just be there, that are going to be part of its identity on the global stage. And I think he has shown and maybe raised the bar for what a Japanese leader can do in living with those constraints and maybe stretching those constraints, but he has not swept them away. And maybe with him goes the dream that those wishes are ever, those challenges are ever going to be swept away once and for all, and that Japan will have to adapt, will have to be creative in living with them. But that maybe is ultimately his legacy. And and meanwhile, in addition to learning to live with those constraints, that there are more problems coming down the road. And I think climate change is the biggest one. Japan is already living with, worse flooding and terrible heat waves. And, that is only going to get worse. And I think the expectation from the world that Japan finds a way to lead on those issues is going to grow, particularly if Japan remains a stable, relatively well-governed democracy. The world's eyes are going to continue to be on Japan. And as climate change worsens, you look back at Abe's legacy. I suspect that is going to loom larger. I don't think people are going to care as much that he didn't revise the Constitution. I think they are going to care, what did you do when you had the political power? What did you do to change Japan's course on emissions? What did you do to make Japan a regional leader or a global leader pushing Japan, as a leader on decarbonization. And I think, as you've looked in these last final years, I think the voices have grown louder criticizing him on issues like that. And I suspect 5 to 10 years that's going to be a big part of his legacy. What didn't he do with the power that he did have? I'm going to stop there, and we can jump into a discussion. I think that touches on my big themes, and thank you.
No, not at all. Thank you. My first question would be: do you think that Prime Minister Abe saw you sleeping in that speech?
The room was surprised. I was actually surprised by how many people were attending. Again, just given you've been out of power for 5 years, but so probably not. I do have a picture that I took with him afterwards, so it's
oh, there you go. You've got proof that it was all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fascinated that you've obviously, Graham Davis was telling me yesterday that people were following your blog, and that you were invited, I think, to something with The Economist at the time, and that was when people started to sort of focus on the fact that you were somebody who was in the know, as it were. Have you always been interested in politics as a child, or why politics and why Japan?
Yeah, I mean, certainly as long as I remember, starting with U.S. politics, of course, and then just one thing after another. I mean, and with Japan, when I was a young first-year university student, the summer before, I got interested in Japanese literature kind of on a whim, and wanted to start studying the language. So I got to university, knocked on the door of the one Japanese language professor because the course was full, and she made room for me. And then from there, I was already interested in politics, and just, one thing led to another, and then, went and worked for a Diet member and started writing, and just, kept learning and kept studying. And I feel like I'm still learning and studying, and, learning new things about Japan, Japanese politics all the time.
Yeah, I saw on Twitter the other day some people talking about, how you can learn more about, or people were very critical or making comment about what had happened, how it had happened, why, I mean, as is always the case on Twitter, I guess, to a certain extent. And somebody who I follow, who I think is very on the job, he said, and he'd worked I think he might be actually still interpreting for a Diet member, but he was saying, you should volunteer for a Diet member or go and ask to work in the office as if you do have interest in politics, because I'm sure in Japan in particular that gives you a really interesting understanding of how government works, how politicians have to fit into that, and how the bureaucracy has shifted, I guess, over the time that you were working with. It was Asao Sensei, wasn't it?
So I got to be in the opposition side during the
which is fascinating, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that was I think part of why people were interested in my blog. I think there was a sense at the time too of trying to figure out who the DBJ were and what they were about. And there's the thing that I learned most. Well, actually, there were a couple of things, because I actually spent a lot of time in his local office, and it was a year with nationwide local elections, and then the upper house elections. So did a lot of stuffing envelopes and putting up posters and distributing flyers outside of train stations. And you want to learn about Japanese politics. That's the way to do it. Right there on the ground, handing out leaflets at 7 in the morning outside of a train station. But the other thing I think you get an appreciation for, it's the kind of things that aren't written in books necessarily. What I really got was a sense of the Japanese political calendar. The year starts, they work on the budget, for the first couple months, ordinary session, they get the budget out of the way, they switch to, other legislation, summer recess, if it's an election year, upper house election, fall, extraordinary session. Just sort of, you can read that, but kind of really getting a sense for the texture of the Japanese political calendar and in a really granular kind of way. There's no substitute for that.
Yeah, well, and it's probably very different to the situation in the States, for example, volunteering. Do you think? Or
I've never worked on Capitol Hill. In some ways I wish I had the experience just for.
You still can, of course.
It's the thing I think, and maybe my thoughts have changed a little bit now that I've just involved in political life in different ways now as I've gotten older. but I mean, I do think actually Japanese democracy is in many ways closer to the people than sometimes, I think, diet members are more accessible. I think they many ways they make themselves more accessible. I mean, I remember, just like the process of, like the Osebo and the Ochugen gifts that, that would come, twice a year. And, all of a sudden in the office, there was like giant box of fruit. I mean, but, like things that you're seeing, the kind of expectations, placed on a diet member to the community and the relationships expected to have. Obviously, democratic lawmakers in every democracy, they're all expected to do things to a certain extent. But I think the Japanese people do expect a certain amount of accessibility from their representatives, and that an approachability, and which it's funny that everyone always says, well, Japan's not really a democracy, the LDP always wins. And there's more, there's definitely more to democracy than who's winning the elections, and there's no question Japan has free and fair elections, meeting sort of the basic standards as far as I'm concerned for what makes a democracy. But I think in where politics fits into people's lives. I mean, and I think the Japanese people expect a lot from their government, which also explains maybe why they're often disappointed and often frustrated with their government. And maybe as an American too.
Turnout though, then Tobias, how does it explain the very low turnout? Because coming from Australia where we've got compulsory voting, right. I guess it's a different structure, of course, to work with. But
turnout has risen and fallen, right? I mean, 2005 and 2009, you had basically, 2009 record turnout, 2005 pretty arid. So you do have moments of really intense interest, and it obviously depends on who's on the ballot and the political circumstances. But even then, you look at Japan's record low electoral lower house turnout of 52%. That's pretty good for a U.S. election. That would be like, wow, 52%. That's all right. It's so it's all relative, I guess. Which the fact that is a record low goes to show that actually for a long time the standards are actually pretty high in expectations of people turning out, and people politics fits into people's lives in all sorts of different ways, whether that's, actually being a member of, someone's koenkai, or, your employer's association, you're going and knocking on doors at the time. I mean, again, there are comparable things in U.S. politics, but, I do think there's more distance between, the average U.S. lawmaker in many ways than, and their voters.
And I think that was evidence, immediately after the Prime Minister's announcement that he would be stepping down. You saw in the list, list of the people he met the next day, representatives from his home prefecture, et cetera, et cetera. So there's obviously a lot more engagement. We've had one question. In fact, I think we've got a couple of questions, but the only one I can see at this stage, not being a professional webinar moderator, is a question from somebody who's asked, what you believe will be Abe's greatest success and why you believe that to be the case.
Well, I'll give a bonus answer. So I'll give an international success and a
that's a good idea, and a domestic
success. So internationally, the relationships that he has built, setting aside the U.S., because the U.S., there's a lot of baggage that comes with that, and ups and downs, and unique challenges to that. But the advances you've seen in relations with India and with Australia in particular, those. I think the expectations for Suga and whoever follows, to keep, to remain invested in those relationships. Because everyone talks about the Abe Modi relationship, for example, and when you look, at a business level, at a military to military level, just at a political engagement level. There's been so much work done between the two governments, and the governments on down, to institutionalize that relationship. And that is, that's the stuff of, the region, kind of fundamentally changing the balance of power in the region. And that, Japan and India being, essentially, counterweights to China on all different fronts. I'm not just talking, strictly, as a military balancing, but just as a, providing alternate visions for investment and aid, and Japan being, now, this, the purveyor of this, quality infrastructure investment push that has, I think, forced China really to change its approach. And India is a partner in that. Australia is a partner in that. That, I mean, unmistakably just, building on, I mean, of course, he built on, a legacy, I think, of Japan being a good friend to countries in that part of the world. But I think he went, I think, beyond, was present, really made it a priority. And it's going to be something that I think every Japanese prime minister is going to have to commit to those relationships. Maybe not quite to the same extent as with the U.S., but not quite as much of a drop off maybe as there was in the past. So I think that's absolutely really an enduring part of his legacy. Domestically, now you can read. There's been many very good pieces written about the legacy of Abenomics, and over the last few years. I mean, I think the main question has been, can we even talk about Abenomics anymore? What I will say though, that while in many respects, I mean, I think it ended up being mostly focused on short-term growth, and from the beginning, that was not necessarily, it was supposed to be about, what is going to be the source of Japan's, is there a sustainable model of growth for the long, for the long term, the medium to long term, and that was really the idea, and I think the results on that front have been very mixed. But what I do want to stress, we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the fact that unemployment, was at record lows, and the jobs applicant ratios were at record highs for a very long stretch. And we shouldn't be surprised that Abe was as popular among young Japanese as he was, and that you look at the breakdowns of his support by age bracket, and he got massive amounts of support from younger Japanese, and I think that's clearly, if you were a young Japanese leaving school, you were leaving school to the best job market in how many decades? I mean, and when you look at what the opposite, when you look at when jobs were scarce and what that meant, to basically a generation of young Japanese, and their kind of foreshortened opportunities and the limits that the fact that Japan is still now living with, what it means to have this large population of non-regular workers, trying to make their way in a system that is still not giving them the same opportunities. I mean, the fact that so many young Japanese did not have to experience that. I mean, that's going to make a huge difference over the long term. Not having to begin their careers like that. So that should not be undervalued. I mean, yes, we can say that that Abenomics did not deliver on the promises it was supposed to, but when you look at the short-term figures, I mean, that still makes a real impact in individual lives, and so I think that has to be considered his greatest achievement.
And I also think, speaking from this perspective of the Australian-Japan Free Trade Agreement and the negotiations that led up to that, there was a great deal of focus on, obviously at the time, and even still now, of course, to a certain extent, the lack of structural, deregulation in the agricultural sector meant that it was very difficult to negotiate or even to begin the negotiations over a free trade agreement. And so I think, if you look at the shift that took place under Abe's sort of leadership, that led not only to the conclusion of our free trade agreement, but then beyond that, the TPP, it's a remarkable shift that's taken place in Japan. And people might not sort of focus on it much because it's not sexy enough, but it's certainly a big change, I would have thought. But obviously in other areas, reforms like, say, for example, workplace and, the hatarakikata kaikaku, coronavirus has probably done a lot to push that forward, sadly, because, it's not something that you would wish upon anybody. But at the same time, the changes that will take place in the reform that will drive might not have taken place to the extent, perhaps, because it had been set up by Abe. I don't know if you think that there's anything in there.
I mean, you've certainly, I think, seen more change probably in the last 6 months than in the previous 3 years. But I mean, the flip side, maybe it did open some space for considering different practices and talking about it. I mean, I think there's definitely something to that, and it definitely changed the discussion. I mean, I think a lot of to some extent, a lot of what he did was changing discourse, changing how people talked about women in the workplace, for example, that maybe the results aren't there, but became part of the discussion in ways that it hadn't quite been before. That is certainly, I think, possible, and we'll have to see how Japan changes going forward, but that's definitely something for subsequent leader. But I think, on the flip side, the Hataraki Kata Kaikaku process, illustrates a lot of why some of the bigger reforms that needed to be done didn't happen. It just ended up being this very prolonged, and you saw this repeat itself over and over again. So, the advisory council proposes, in the growth strategy, okay, we're going to study this, and then, the council specifically focused on that issue draws up its recommendations. Then those recommendations get translated into legislation. Maybe the legislation gets delayed for reasons unrelated to the legislation. Then it's to the fall session, and then there's the process of implementing. It just ended up being, maybe Abe was being a realist on that front. And I think to some extent, it always helps to compare him with Koizumi, the last long-serving prime minister. Koizumi was someone who, wanted the big confrontation, and he was gonna, lay it all on the table, and there was gonna be the big battle, and either he was gonna win or he was gonna lose, but it was gonna be done. And that was clearly not how Abe wanted to proceed on really any of these issues. So he wanted to. I think, to his credit, I think he wanted to find a way to, repeatedly was trying to get the interest group targeted for reform to buy on, to what was being proposed. You saw it with agricultural reform, you saw corporate governance. I think there was always a sense of better to find a way to make headway without having all-out resistance than to have all-out resistance and then risk being defeated. And maybe he would have achieved more with, and I think there's definitely a, when you read sort of critical pieces about Abenomics, that, he was too timid. He didn't want to risk political capital on these issues. But, there might be another way of seeing it, that this is also just the reality of kind of big economic reform in an advanced industrial democracy. Exactly. Anything you reform, there's going to be someone on the other side of that. And, certainly if you want to do lots of different things and experiment with lots of different things, you might be better off, accepting kind of a smaller victory on one issue and then, surviving to fight another day on some other issue.
Using your political capital elsewhere.
Yeah. I don't know if the debate, if there's a way of proving it one way or another, but I think you could certainly see that he saw value in a different approach than Koizumi.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you, I'd be interested to get your view on where you think we're heading. Obviously this week will tell us all, if we don't already know. If, say, for example, Suga-san is in fact, chosen, as he seems to be by most of the factions and what have you, what type of a prime minister does he's made it very clear that he believes that he's got to deal with the coronavirus, COVID-19. He's got to look at how that plays out for a number of different areas, but mostly in a very domestic focus, I would imagine. But, where does it leave him in terms of that sort of area where he seemed to not be as potentially strong as a domestically well-known politician overseas? That must put a lot of pressure on him and Japan, probably.
Yeah, certainly feeling you're reaching the standard that Abe set. And he, of course, taking over at a moment where it's not really possible to duplicate Abe's travels, right? Where the fact that Abe took 81 foreign trips in less than 8 years. That was just showing up. Big part of being president internationally is showing up and being there and making voice heard. Suga is not going to really have that option available, at least for a little while. Certainly to the extent that Abe was able to use it. So that's, definitely going to be a challenge he's going to have to overcome. And maybe now the narrative is changing, but I think, when it first looked like Suga, I think there was a sense that, that obviously he's going to be a caretaker, that clearly, he's older, he wants to just, finish Abe's term, and there's no reason to expect that, he's been in the shadow. So why should we expect him to last? And I think there are reasons to think that he could be well positioned. I'd say could, because I think, he's got a lot of issues on his plate. It's going to be, it'll be tough for anyone. But there are a few reasons I think that could give him enough, that he brings enough to the premiership, or could bring enough to the premiership that we could be seeing him for a while. One, we've all, I think, kind of got used to the idea that he just wanted to be in the background because that's what he's been doing for almost 8 years. But the fact is, yes, he inhabited that role, but you realize, as we've seen some of the profiles of him that have been published now in recent days, that there's plenty of material there for him to connect with voters. And the fact that he is, he comes from a background, not a hereditary politician, growing up in Akita, making his way, rising from being a lowly political secretary, climbing the ladder rung by rung in Yokohama, and elected the Diet, becoming a cabinet minister 10 years later, which is a pretty impressive feat. He is a formidable character in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that was because he was sort of at Abe's service for so long, it was sort of easy to forget maybe that just how formidable he is. But I think a lot of Abe's successes were due to him. I mean, you talk about Japan becoming a leader in trade agreements in a way that it had never done before, which, that would, just going back to your earlier point, that would definitely be probably tied for his greatest international achievement. But, a lot of that was Suga. A lot of that was him, working within the cabinet secretariat, to make the, put together the agreement, and cutting across ministerial lines, making sure everyone was on the same page, and overcoming resistance, from JA and from, within the LDP. A lot of that was due to him. He obviously has an extensive set of relationships across the LDP with Komeito, in the economy and society at large. He has plenty of resources and acumen that will be at his disposal. There's no question that there was reason to think that he can do the job that's going to be demanded of him. International experience is going to be a problem because he doesn't have the English, doesn't have the relationships with these leaders quite the same way that Abe has, and it's something he's going to have to work at. And I think a lot is going to depend on who his foreign minister is, who his national security advisor is, who's going to fill these jobs. But the other thing, and my Twitter presence. I've been reading his 2012 book, which is basically
fascinating. I'm glad you're translating it as you go.
Yeah, it's very boring in many ways because it's not a typical politician's memoir. It really is. It's an account of his year as a cabinet minister and the issues he was dealing with, but the portrait that it portrays is Suga as a problem solver. Someone who, wants to solve problems, wants to use the bureaucracy. That's sort of the running theme, and you're trying to get the bureaucracy to keep its eyes on, you're here to solve problems for the Japanese people, so let's do that, and let's not get caught up in infighting between ministries or customs. He very and I keep coming back to the contrast between Abe's book, right? With Tsukushi, which opens with the discussion of what is a conservative, what is the liberal, and this very abstract discussion of these ideologies and how you define them. And there's none of that. Suga. I don't. If you look at his memberships and organizations, I think officially he's a member of Nippon Kaigi. He is not that kind of politician. That is not how he thinks. He wants to use the national government to solve problems, and make the lives of the Japanese people better. And it helped that he was.
Sorry, I'm fascinated. I read somewhere that he obviously his family didn't want him to. He was expected to sort of take over the family farm.
Right.
And that he virtually defied them to, well, I don't know what the level of defiance was, but he came to Tokyo instead and sought a political career. How much, he's not a political dynasty family, therefore, unlike Abe. Does that set him free to a certain extent? Does it give him some options in terms of his thinking? You've read that book and you can see how he wants to move around the bureaucracy. He doesn't strike me as being the entirely like factional bureaucracy, like politics man.
Yeah, I mean I'd like to. I mean, the way I've been thinking of him, as I'm trying to kind of sort my own thoughts out about him and what to expect from him, is that he's a national politician, as distinct from, say, like a particularistic politician, where ties to one particular place, or a faction, or an LDP policy tribe, or something. I mean, he obviously has areas that I think he's interested in. I think he you just have to listen to him for a few minutes. Telecom policy and communication. Like, this is obviously something that he cares about, but it's not because he's wedded to the social bureaucracy. This is not because of that. And I think having grown up in one place and built a career first as a local politician in another place, in very different places, right? Rural Akita and urban Yokohama. I mean, that I think he has an ability to look at Japan's problems nationally. Centralization, I think, is something else he really cares about. And making the lives of people better, closer to where they live. I mean, I think this is what it's something I think he keeps coming back to. I think it's going to be, for sure, going to be themes that he would pursue. It's not. I mean, it's just he's a very different kind of politician than Abe, and I think there's no escaping that. Abe is sort of a Gaullist kind of figure, right? That it's all about grandeur. It's all about Japan, standing up in the world and competing among the great powers. But it's very very removed from the everyday concerns, and the fact that he had to constantly be prodded to remember that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Then he gets into trouble in his first premiership for not remembering that. And Suga being there, over the last 8 years, whispering in his ear, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. Suga, which I think that will absolutely serve him in good stead. Knowing the kind of things that voters want, and the fact that he does come from, he's closer to the voters, he does, try to keep in mind, always, kind of work hard every day to make life, the lives of the Japanese people better. And, that it's hard to see how that is a liability. I mean,
absolutely. Do you think Abe will continue to influence him if in fact Suga becomes prime minister, if she says?
I mean, it's hard not to see Abe playing some role. I mean, and you look at his grandfather, resigned in 1960 and was in the Diet for another couple of decades. I mean, I don't know if Abe has a couple more decades in the Diet or not, but I mean, and certainly, as and Suga and whoever follows him, I think Abe as a personal envoy of the prime minister, and using the relationships he has with leaders in lots of different countries, it is very easy in my mind to see him playing that role and to want to play that role. I mean, I think I think he clearly enjoys kind of personal diplomacy and going abroad and building those relationships and having those relationships. I certainly can see him continuing to do that.
So you think that might be a sort of a bridge for Suga potentially to maintain the global presence that Australia has, that Japan has developed with countries in Asia Pacific, but more broadly through Europe and of course the United States. That's interesting you say that, because I saw a couple of quotes yesterday from Suga saying that people shouldn't be panicking in any way about his capability, or as you say, his acumen for foreign policy, because he was there with Abe the whole way through. So I think I'm also fascinated by people who are saying, what is this man Suga like? And I thought he was in front of the media for nearly 8 years every day. I mean, it's remarkable that people can't get a measure of the man from that in itself, but I'm sure there's a lot more to him than those press interviews and the like. We've had quite a few questions from different people, and I just wondered if I could, we've only got about 15 minutes left, if I could grab your really quick thoughts on, say, for example, I've been asked whether the Constitution, the debate about Japan changing the Constitution, where is that now, and where will that be with Suga? And then a couple of questions about, say, for example, the rather dismal state of gender sort of management, and what part of Suga's handling in the future, will either improve that or do something to make things better, if because it can't get worse in our view. Over and above that, Russia and North Korea, and then I want to leave most of our time for a discussion on the United States and Japan, if that's possible. Sorry.
Yeah. So let's just go in order. Constitution, I think obviously very disappointing for Abe to leave office not having done it. Central political goal for his entire career. The one thing I think he did do, and to the extent that we're even having a conversation about this, I mean, whatever taboos remained about constitution revision as an agenda item, and something that the prime minister can talk openly about, that he was able, he proposed amendments and that didn't go anywhere, but that the idea, there's no more taboo about revision now. I mean, it really is, it's a legitimate discussion, topic for discussion for parties to debate about. There are no more taboos. I mean, even Article 9, he proposed to change to Article 9, didn't go anywhere, but I mean, I think, it's there, and just raising it is not, alone is not going to lead to a prime minister getting in trouble. And that, just going back to the start of his career in the early 90s, I mean, that is a big change. Oddly enough, with Abe leaving, the chances of revision happening, if it ever gets high enough on the agenda, is probably higher. I mean, I think when you look at polls over the last few years, support for revision in the abstract was always higher than when polls asked, do you support revision under Abe? It was always more popular in the abstract than under, specifically under this prime minister. And I think, I think there was something off-putting for a lot of people by his zeal for it. That it's never, it's always one of the lowest priority issues in polls. I mean, this is just not something that I think most voters think the government needs to be spending time worrying about.
Do you think the voters, or do you think Suga thinks that the voters need more focus on North Korea and Russia, for example, or?
I mean, it's going to always be economic issues, and certainly at this moment, it's going to be COVID-19. Managing the economic fallout of it, ensuring that things don't get worse. Ensuring that there aren't, a serious outbreak, that really causes, leads to shutdowns and more economic pain.
Sure.
And that's going to be, for the foreseeable future, clearly, that's going to be top of mind.
Do you think, therefore, given that the economy will do better if women are able to participate in the economy, that we would have worked that argument out, and that it would be a big part of the next sort of 2 or 3
I think it's going to still be part of the agenda. I mean, the question is, as LDP leader, will Suga do more to bring women in? I mean, that remains, a question to be answered. Can you just recruit more female candidates? Because that's the only way you're ever going to see more women competing for the top jobs. So you've got to do that. The one thing I will say about Suga, because he was basically Abe's, personnel chief, and one of the major reforms of Abe's tenure was creating a cabinet personnel bureau. And from day one, even before the bureau existed, Suga said to all the to the ministries, I am going to have the final say on every bureaucratic promotion, and they better be run by me. And they used that power to advance women. I mean, you saw women in administrative vice minister jobs, bureau chiefs, section chiefs. That when given the power to actually appoint those, to fill those positions directly, they did use that to move women up the hierarchy. And when you combine that with the fact that in recent years you look at who's been taking the administrative exams to join the bureaucracy, then who actually ends up joining. I mean, increasingly now you have entering classes that have maybe not quite at 50 women, but you're getting there. So the Japanese bureaucracy is changing. I mean, and that is a big change. Changing how the Japanese bureaucracy looks and how it reacts to the public and relates to the public and the kind of concerns. I mean, that's gonna, I do think that's the kind of change that maybe the effects aren't immediately apparent. But as those women rise through the bureaucracy, and if again, this is an area where there's direct control. You don't have to convince the private sector to do something. that if the
Well, the
bureaucracy,
private sector is probably in many ways in, leading. So if you can get that top,
yeah, right,
to do what they do and then get some change in the bureaucracy, that might bring it about. Well,
right, make the bureaucracy more family friendly. I mean, all
yeah,
of that.
absolutely, all those
So,
issues.
so I mean, I expect that's going to continue to be part of the agenda. I mean, I don't think it's going to fall off. I mean, I think the bottom up demands for doing more are there. I mean, with labor force participation up, there's going to be more demands for opportunities, and so the work is not done.
No,
I don't think we can say that Suga is going to be unresponsive to that, though. I mean, I don't think we.
I don't mean to throw this one in because I didn't ask you this before, but what about climate change? Is he going to be a prime minister who focuses on climate change and using his problem solving skills to do that? That was a question we had.
I wish so. I don't think we've seen anything in particular in his record that would suggest that it's something that he's spent a lot of time thinking about. I mean, it's not not necessarily a big part of his portfolio. And
the recent typhoons and the Kyushu, the devastation in Kyushu will probably give rise to some discussion, at least, of the need for this, but how much of a priority that is. So tell me about the US and Japan and where you think things are going. And I know I asked you this before we started, but what does a Suga-Biden relationship look like? And what does a Suga-Trump relationship look like? And how does it impact on US-Japan relations? We've only got 7 minutes for that giant.
Okay. Well, I mean, a Suga-Biden administration is, I think you'd have two at the top. You'd have people, who are just, who've done this for a while, who are professional. A Biden administration is going to have a lot of people who've been in government before, who know the U.S.-Japan relationship inside and out. Who managed, in many cases were involved, during the Obama administration, and despite. Sometimes you hear in Kasumigaseki about how bad the Obama years were. I mean, you had an administration in the U.S. that wanted to be in Asia, that saw Japan as an important partner for that, and was really willing to work. Even though I don't think the Obama administration was terribly happy to see Abe come back, but I think they managed to find a way to work with him quite effectively anyway. And so, I mean, I don't think there's any reason to think that you'd see friction with Suga, for any particular. There's not any particular reason to expect that. With Trump, obviously, it's harder to say. I mean, because now we have this model of Abe investing so much from the beginning, to have that personal relationship, and we can talk about what he's gotten for that. But I think it's easy to imagine ways in which if Abe hadn't invested quite that much. That the U.S.-Japan relationship doesn't look quite as good after the last few years. And you can see that I don't think you can say that Abe has changed Trump's mind when it comes to Trump takes office with these long-held views about U.S. allies taking advantage of the United States, and we shouldn't have these allies and they should all pay more. Given that you have a president who I think still believes those things, I don't think you have any reason to think he doesn't believe those things. The fact that I think maybe for a while was able to keep Japan just off the radar screen anyway, and Trump's attention was elsewhere, and that was able to kind of hold out for what ended up being, I think, a not terrible bilateral trade agreement, even though Japan, even though Abe didn't want to be in those talks to begin with, but being on the defensive, still managed to, I think, hold out. The alliance is intact, although the biggest question for Suga is how to handle host-nation support talks. I mean, and that issue is those talks are going to start imminently, and from and probably won't really start in earnest until after the U.S. election's over. I mean, I think being aware too that regardless of the outcome of the election, given what appears to be likely to happen when the election itself is held, and that we might not have an outcome for some time, and potential for real instability in the United States. I think maybe even the bigger challenge than what is the relationship going to be with one leader versus the other is what is it going to mean for Japan if the United States remains really deeply divided and polarized. Even if we get a Biden administration, how effective is that administration going to be? Is Japan what is relying on the United States for its security going to mean, if the United States is really in the midst of a governance crisis? I mean, and I don't
US-China relations, I mean, how that relationship impacts Japan, of course, too.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
because a lot of that instability will play out there in China, won't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I think that, I mean, in some ways, at least, beyond the next few months, I mean, really thinking as we head into the 2020s and what this decade will look like for Japan, that if the United States doesn't find a way, to fix its democracy, to address, the really kind of deep grievances with how the system is working itself. Like if Trump wins, for example, it just looks very unlikely that he would win the popular vote. And so to have a system where, one party will have won the popular vote once, since 1988, and yet held the presidency for the majority of that time. That is a remarkable failure of a system, and I think will lead to such widespread disillusionment, even more maybe than you've already seen. And if you're Japan, if you're an American ally, I mean, you do have to wonder that if there's a crisis, what am I going to be able to get from the U.S. government in a crisis? How much am I going to be able to rely? What sort of decisions, decision-making apparatus is there? Can the United States president rally the country around a decision, to commit American lives and American money behind to support an ally in a crisis? I mean, that question is only going to grow in importance, and so that, I mean, that would be the thing that just gives me the most pause, and certainly if I were sitting in the Conte, would spend a lot of time wondering about the answer to that question.
Well, especially ahead of the General Assembly of the United Nations, there are some sort of key policy statements, and of course we've had one question about the Prime Minister's decision on Japan's strike capabilities in enemy territories. Obviously, do you have an opinion? I mean, the decision will be made, and I mean that'll impact on all of these things too, won't it? But I've just seen the time, and because I'm a terrible timekeeper and not a very good moderator, I would like to make a suggestion to the broader Chamber of Commerce community that we engage you again when you're not so rushed with all of the post or book publishing related activities, because I think there'll be a great deal of interest from a number of the Chamber members about the US-Japan relationship in terms of ahead of the election in the United States, but also once we know who the Prime Minister is and what we know a little bit more about the challenges that he'll face in the future. So it just leaves me now to thank you greatly for your time. I don't even know what time it is there, or I think you're in DC. Exactly, go to bed and you've got young children, so it's a tricky time for you. But we'd just like to thank you, bravo, for your excellent work. I suggest that everybody go and buy the book the minute it's available in our local bookstores, which will be October.
So in Japan, in fact, Kinokuniya tweeted a picture of it.
I saw that, yeah.
So it's, and there's, I mean, Amazon Japan will have it once it's out in the United States because they're sourcing from the United States. So, but that's going to be soon because my publisher moved it up, thankfully. So,
well,
yes,
congratulations on
look out, and hopefully it will be in your hands soon.
Well, congratulations, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. And I think we've just got an agreement from Tobias to come back and delve further into Japanese politics, US politics. But in the meantime, jump on Twitter and see and follow Tobias, because he has great insights. And I've learned a lot from him. I'm sure you all will. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you to the BCCJ for hosting us here in these very special studio circumstances. And I look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Sayonara.